There are moments in life when the world feels familiar. The streets, the air, the rhythm of every step, everything seems ordinary. Yet hidden beneath that calm lies something waiting, something that watches quietly from the edges of the light. You do not notice it at first. You walk, you breathe, you live as if nothing could ever change. But then in a single instant, everything does. Because sometimes it is not what you see that terrifies you. It is what is no longer there. This is the story of a night that began like any other, and of a shadow that refused to follow it. Began on a night that felt no different from any other, a calm sky above, and the faint hum of the city fading into the distance. The narrator walks slowly through the quiet street. Their footsteps steady their thoughts wandering beneath the pale orange glow of the streetlights. The air hung thick with silence. But there was something about that silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt watchful, heavy, as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They turned a corner and glanced down at the pavement where their shadow should have stretched behind them, long and dark under the light. But there was nothing, no trace of movement, no faint outline following their steps. The ground was empty, blank, as if it had forgotten how to remember their shape. For a moment they froze, the realization small but sharp, spreading through them like ice crawling under their skin. They took another step forward, expecting it to return, but the darkness remained, still refusing to respond. It wasn't the light that was wrong. The lamp above glowed strong and steady. This was something different, something that made the world feel off balance, as if reality itself had missed a beat. Their heart pounded faster, and they found themselves glancing around as if someone or something unseen was near everywhere. They looked. The same emptiness followed. No shadow on the ground, no silhouette cast on the wall nearby. It was as if a part of them had been erased from the world, as if the night had taken what belonged to them and decided not to give it back. They waved their hand, tried to move in different directions, but nothing changed. Their body moved, yet no reflection of darkness responded. A chill settled deep inside them, not from the cold, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being truly alone. It was not the loneliness of being without people. It was the loneliness of being without oneself. For the first time they realized how much comfort a shadow could bring, how silently it followed, without question, how loyal it had always been. And now it was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that words could not touch. The silence around them deepened. The light seemed to flicker, not from weakness, but from fear, as if even it knew something unnatural had happened. And in that moment, they understood something had shifted the balance between them, and the darkness had changed forever. The shadow began to move on its own, long before the narrator truly noticed it. At first it was just a feeling like being watched when no one was there, a faint flicker at the edge of their vision. Something dark slipping away just as they turned to look. It seemed harmless, an illusion born of exhaustion or imagination. But soon it started happening more often. The dark outline that once followed them obediently now appeared in places it shouldn't be. When they sat still, it moved. When they stood still, it swayed. When they turned around, it froze, as if mocking them for not understanding what was happening. Days turned into nights filled with unease. The narrator found themselves staring at walls, floors, mirrors, trying to catch the moment their shadow would reappear, only to find that it had begun to live by its own rules. It was no longer bound to their body or the light that created it. Sometimes it showed itself far from them, stretching across the room, even when the light source made no sense, its edges sharp, its movements deliberate. It was no longer a reflection, it was something alive, something aware. The distortion grew bolder. The shadow began appearing in places the narrator had never been. They would hear from others about a dark figure that looked like them, standing at street corners, lingering outside their house, slipping past hallways in the dead of night. It started to mimic them, but not perfectly. Its movements were off, slower, more deliberate, as if learning how to be human. It wasn't just an absence of light anymore. It had become something with purpose and thought. Every time the narrator tried to ignore it, the shadow found new ways to remind them of its presence. They would wake up to see it standing at the foot of their bed, detached from their sleeping body, or catch it walking across the wall even when no light touched it. It seemed to feed on attention, growing darker, stronger, more defined as the fear deepened. It wasn't just following them, it was studying them, learning them, recreating them inch by inch. Soon the narrator couldn't tell who was copying whom. When they raised a hand, the shadow would hesitate before following, as if deciding whether it wanted to obey or resist. The bond that once tied them together was breaking. And in that rift between human and darkness, something else was being born, something that wanted freedom from the light that had once kept it bound. It began slowly, almost quietly, as if the world was whispering secrets. Behind the narrator's back, people started noticing something that the narrator could not explain. They would speak in uneasy tones, saying they had seen a figure that looked exactly like them standing in places where they had never been. At first it was brushed off as confusion, maybe a trick of the eyes, or someone who merely resembled them, but the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. The shadow was no longer lost. It had simply chosen a new path, one that no longer needed its master. A friend mentioned seeing the narrator outside their house late at night, just standing by the gate, motionless face hidden in darkness. When the narrator heard this, they froze, because at that same time, they had been inside their home, trying desperately to sleep another day. A neighbor claimed they saw their silhouette walking down the street at dawn when the narrator was still in bed. The shape moved like them, had their build and their posture. But there was something strange about it. It never blinked, never turned its head. It simply walked with purpose, disappearing into the mist. Rumors began to spread, and with them came fear whispers that the narrator had been wandering the streets at strange hours, without memory of it. They began doubting themselves, wondering if they were sleepwalking, losing control of their mind. But deep down, they knew it was something else, something that had once belonged to them, but now lived on its own. The shadow had escaped the boundaries of light, and had found a way to exist freely, to live as something separate, something untethered. Wherever the narrator went, they felt its presence, even when unseen. It was there, hiding in reflections behind glass, standing in the corners of rooms where light couldn't reach. Sometimes they would see movement in the distance, only to realize it moved the way they did, but slower, almost deliberate, like it was choosing which parts of them to imitate. Each sighting left behind a chill, as if the air had turned heavy with invisible eyes. Watching, learning, remembering, the haunting grew worse. The shadow started to interact with others. It began to mimic the narrator's voice, whispering their name from dark hallways, answering when someone called them, even though they were nowhere near it. Knew their gestures, their habits, their smallest details. It had become a living echo, wandering the world, pretending to be them. And the scariest part was how convincing it was. Those who saw it said it felt almost human, almost real, but not quite, like something missing a heartbeat or a soul. As days passed, the narrator's fear grew into desperation. They began to question their own existence. If their shadow was living freely, then what were they? Just a hollow shell left behind by something more powerful. It was no longer about losing a shadow. It was about losing identity. The line between the living person and the living darkness was beginning to blur, until the narrator could no longer tell which one was truly real. It was only after endless nights of fear and confusion that the truth began to surface. Buried deep within the narrator's mind, a memory long forgotten started to claw its way back, like something that refused to stay buried. The shadow's rebellion wasn't random. It was born from something darker, something the narrator had done long ago, something that had stained their soul in ways they could no longer deny. The more they tried to run from it, the stronger the shadow became, as if feeding on guilt, growing larger every time they pretended to forget. There had been a moment once when the narrator had crossed a line between right and wrong, a decision that seemed small at the time, but had left a scar, invisible to others, yet visible to the darkness itself. Perhaps it was a betrayal, perhaps an act of cruelty, perhaps a choice made out of fear that cost someone else dearly. Whatever it was, the shadow had carried it silently, following loyally for years, absorbing every ounce of regret, every lie, every moment of denial, until it became too heavy to bear. One day it simply broke free. The narrator began to notice how the shadow's movements mirrored not their actions, but their emotions. It appeared when guilt rose in their chest. It twisted and warped when they tried to hide their truth. It was no longer a reflection. It was an accusation, a living embodiment of the Part of them they refused to face. Every time they looked at its dark shape, they saw fragments of their past mistakes swirling within it like black smoke. Memories they wished to erase, yet could never escape. They tried everything to destroy it. They turned off the lights, avoided mirrors, hid in darkness, thinking that without light, the shadow would vanish. But it never left. Even in complete blackness, it lingered, felt, rather than seen, a cold presence pressing against their mind, whispering in silence, reminding them that they were the reason it existed, and that it could never truly disappear, because it was them. The more the narrator fought it, the more it resisted. The more they denied their sin, the stronger the shadow became, until it began to move ahead of them, no longer following, but leading, showing them flashes of what they had done in distorted visions. Every flicker of movement, every dark corner brought with it a reminder, a punishment, a truth that refused to die. People around them began to feel it too. Rooms grew colder when they entered, lights flickered even when, untouched by wind, the air thickened. As if carrying the weight of unspoken guilt, the shadow had become a manifestation of consequence, a living echo of everything the narrator had tried to bury, and now it was demanding acknowledgement. It no longer wanted to follow, because it had carried the burden of their sins for too long. It wanted freedom from the one who created it, freedom from the lies, freedom from the human it once belonged to. The moment of realization came slowly creeping through the cracks of denial, like a whisper that refused to fade. The narrator finally began to understand that the shadow was not an enemy. It was not some spirit or curse sent to haunt them. It was the part of themselves they had long abandoned, the side that carried every mistake, every fear, every truth they refused to face. When it stopped following them, it was not rebelling against the light. It was breaking free from the person who had forgotten what it meant to be whole. The nights grew quieter, yet heavier. The air felt alive with something unseen. The narrator could feel it, watching from the corners of the room, not with hatred, but with a strange sorrow, as if it too longed for peace. They began to remember all the times they had ignored that presence within them, how they had buried their pain, their guilt, their humanity under layers of pride and silence, and now that darkness had taken shape, standing before them as a reminder that what you run from never truly disappears. It just waits. Every mirror became a doorway into that truth, their reflection unchanged, but the space behind them alive. The shadow no longer mirrored their movements. It stood still, as if waiting for them to acknowledge it, to see it not as a monster, but as a memory they had tried to erase. The room would grow colder, the air stiller, every time they tried to look away. And yet, in that stillness there was a pull, a connection that felt both terrifying and familiar. The more they looked, the more they saw pieces of themselves reflected in that darkness. They realized then that the shadow had refused to follow, because it no longer recognized the person it belonged to. It had once represented loyalty, a constant companion that walked beside them, but years of denial had twisted it into something else, something distant. It wanted to be free from the lies, from the pain, from the endless weight of pretending to be whole when the soul was fractured. The shadow began to appear in dreams, whispering not in words, but in feelings, a deep ache that throbbed behind every heartbeat. In those dreams, the narrator saw themselves standing face to face with the shadow, both identical, yet impossibly different. The human, filled with fear and shame, the shadow calm and patient. As if waiting for acceptance in that moment, they began to see the truth. The shadow was not darkness. It was reflection. It carried every emotion, every secret, every scar, and when it refused to follow, it was simply demanding to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be understood. The world around them grew quieter, as if holding its breath. The flickering lights softened, the walls seemed to fade, until there was nothing but the two of them standing between light and dark. And for the first time, the narrator felt what it meant to be truly seen, not by others, but by the part of themselves they had long tried to forget. And as the final light faded, the narrator stood still, surrounded by a silence that felt alive. They understood now that the shadow had never been lost. It had only been waiting for them to face the truth within themselves. The darkness they feared was not an enemy, but a mirror of what they had become the moment they accepted it. The air grew calm. The world felt whole again. The shadow did not vanish. It simply returned to its place quietly behind them, where it had always belonged, not as a curse, but as a reminder that even in darkness, we are never truly alone.